Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to the 10th Annual HRRC Human Rights Forum, the Days of Remembrance. We recognize that the pandemic is still a big part in today's world, so we wanted to recognize and thank both those attending in person and those attending virtually.
Today's event was organized by members of the Human Rights and Relations Commission as a way to remember survivors of the Holocaust and their unique experiences. These stories are vital to our society, as we can never forget the tragic experiences of the past. Today's speaker, Mr. Manny Gabler, will shed light on his experiences as a refugee in Shanghai, China.
While you listen to Mr. Gabler's story, we ask that you take this time to reflect upon what you're hearing and about the impacts of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism that have and are still felt in today's world.
And now a word from our mayor, Mr. James Hovland.
Thank you. Said they wanted to wipe the microphone, but I don't think it's necessary. Well, good evening, everybody. Whether you're here or with us in the virtual world, I'm Jim Hovland. I'm the mayor of Edina. One of my colleagues is here with me this evening, Ron Anderson from the City Council. And we just had a meeting this morning sitting as the Housing and Redevelopment Authority, and our city manager, Scott Neal, is here as well. And then Carolyn Jackson, our other colleague, one of our other colleagues from the City Council, is here this evening too. Thank you for being here. You know, folks, this is something that we've done for years, and I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the country. We've got some smoke in the air tonight, but you know, the smell of tyranny drifts on a transcontinental wind. Very pleasing to some. This desire for a government in which a single ruler is vested with absolute power manifests itself with a seditious attack on the seat of government. Is it a warning of things to come? Has the world seen this before? People easily swayed by the voice of tyranny, cloaked cleverly in patriotic cloth, find comfort that their prejudices need not be suppressed any longer, but can be openly expressed. Their leader has told them so. Those amplified voices of prejudice foster divisiveness, which next creates a chasm between us. Society's values and security are threatened. Civility and respect are lost. Bad angels dominate certain personalities, and they first snicker and then revel in the hatred being created. Is it 1933 all over again? In the U.S. Holocaust Museum, it says, "Never stop asking why." We've heard the stories of Holocaust survivors many times in Edina. There's our stories that never get old or diminished in importance. As at the Holocaust Museum, we leave this seat of local government every year, following our days of remembrance, asking ourselves why, and saying never again. We know the horrific crimes hatred can cause. We will be reminded of that again tonight by Mr. Manny Gabler, with whom we are honored to have with us. Mr. Gabler, thank you for being here. We eagerly wait his words of advice and wisdom. Introducing Mr. Gabler tonight is Mr. Steve Hunnigs, the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council in the Twin Cities. His work has also been his calling for many years as he helped each generation not to forget and never stop asking why. Edina has recognized the Day of Remembrance annually ever since the event was created nationally. I believe we are now the only community in the Twin Cities which continues to hold this event each year. Our HRRC, Human Rights and Relations Commission, and our community recognize its importance, and it may be more important than ever. Holding this event each year is something we intend to do into the future. Please help me thank our HRRC members and our youth commissioners for making this event possible, and give Mr. Gabler and Mr. Hunnigs a warm Edina welcome. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Mayor Hovland. We're Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota, the JCRC of the three states, and mayors from Grand Forks originally, and so that's well within our catchment area, and we had a nice exchange and conversation about the wonderful Jewish community in Grand Forks and B'nai Israel Synagogue. So when you say a warm welcome, I know your friendship with the Jewish community began, it sounds like when you were a small boy up in Grand Forks, so thank you very much. Want to thank the whole city of Edina, everyone here, folks watching remotely, for this very warm welcome and for all you're doing. Days of Remembrance, the Hebrew word is zachor. That means remember, and it's a command. But I also want to tell you that I'm humbled to be here, born in St. Louis Park, raised in St. Louis Park, now live in St. Louis Park, and here I am finding myself in the Edina City Council chambers. So it doesn't get much better than that. So thank you very much for that. To the Human Rights Council, to Chair Epstein, to Vice Chair Stringer Moore, thank you very much for your leadership. To members of the City Council here, to the City Manager, it demonstrates great respect for human rights, and we deeply appreciate the leading role of Edina in promoting human rights. In reading about the work of the Human Rights Commission, I saw there was a reference to the case of Shelley v. Kramer from 1948. That was the case in which the Supreme Court said courts could no longer enforce restrictive racial covenants, a really important decision. Nevertheless, it took 20 years until the passage of the Fair Housing Act before racial covenants actually became illegal in the United States. Minnesota was a little ahead. 1962, we passed a law outlawing racial and restrictive covenants based upon race or other protected classifications. So our history is all around us. You know, I commend to you, speaking of that, Kirsten Delagarde and her Mapping Prejudice project, which is all about restrictive racial covenants and other covenants throughout Ramsey County and Hennepin County, which of course includes Edina and St. Louis Park. It's a wonderful learning experience for everybody, and what she's trying to do to make us aware of our history and how it can make for a better future. And then soon I'll get a chance to introduce my dear friend Manny Gabler. Wonderful story he tells. He always got a smile on his face. One of the best people I've ever met in my life. Kathy is here, too. So that is indeed a great honor. Mike had asked me, Chair Epstein had asked me to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism. But before I ever do that, I have to say the following. You know, again, 3 states, 225,000 square miles. I will tell you, I will affirm to you, that our work is far more often characterized by goodwill, partnership, friendship, and the things that we can all do together to improve society. Yes, I also appreciate the fact that there are issues we have to address, that we have a current spasm of violence associated with anti-Semitism. 100%, that's one of our community responsibilities, is community security. I don't deny that for a second. But let's keep it all in perspective. For American Jews, there has never been a better time or place to live. So please keep that in mind and keep that in context as we discuss these issues. Indeed, Professor Salo Baron, who was the first chair at a major American university of Jewish studies, said, avoid the temptation of the Lachrymose view of Jewish history. That is, don't see Jewish history as a progression of pogroms and massacres culminating in the Holocaust. That's not the Jewish people. That's not our history. It's part of our history and a critical portion of it, but we're optimistic. You'll hear that Manny's story, when Manny's voice and what Manny has done with his life after China. And that's just sort of a great example of how people have taken difficulties in their life and transformed the communities in which they've lived. It's true, we have seen a rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and throughout the world. You know, ADL polls every year on these numbers. The good news is, by ADL polling statistics, about 10% of the people anti-Semitic by the way they answer questions. Well, that's still 20 million, 25 million Americans. You know, there are a couple questions, interestingly, after all these years, where that number spikes. 30% of people believed American Jews are more loyal to Israel than the United States. Very dangerous dual loyalty. And about another 30% still believe Jews are collectively responsible for the death of Jesus, a deicide. So we still have issues in our country in education to do. You know, during the recent escalation of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians in Gaza, there was a study that showed 17,000 times in 1 week in May, it was tweeted Hitler was right. So what we're telling you is there's still worldwide issues, and as much as I'm an incorrigible optimist, I also appreciate the fact that we have a lot of work to do in the world. And in our country, and this is why this becomes an American story, a story for all of us. We saw what happened last couple of years. Poway, Pittsburgh, attacks on synagogues by right-wing extremists, people motivated by hate, people who wanted to attack Jews because they were assumed to be supportive of immigrant rights. That's what happened in both of those cases, in Pittsburgh and Poway. But during May and June of this year, we saw Jews attacked from the left, from the extreme left, as proxies for Israel, whether it was Chicago, New York, or Los Angeles. What does that tell you? American Jews being caught in the pincers between hatred on the left and hatred in the right. But what does it tell all of us? And that is the following, that there are people, there are Americans, our fellow Americans, who want to use violence to advance political causes, which is so detrimental to democracy, as the mayor was talking about, and talking about what happened in Germany. We're not Weimar Germany. Our democracy is so powerful and so strong after all these years. However, it cannot be denied that there are people in our country who would want to turn us into Weimar and attack our democracy from the inside. So this is a lesson. It may be about anti-Semitism, but this is something that all Americans have to take into account, and we must do everything we can to protect our democracy. And that's why I'm so proud of Edina having Days of Remembrance here in the City Council chambers, because it reinforces the message what we want to send, that there's nothing more sacred than the rule of law in due process in the United States. So again, thank you to Edina for making that really important point. The JCRC, through our democracy project with Concordia College, Moorhead, and St. Benedict's in Collegeville, that's something that we're emphasizing, is the need for civility in public discussion, because that's the only way we can conduct ourselves as Americans, building a country in which we all have a stake. We have an exhibit right now at the American Swedish Institute, Kindertransport, which was an effort to save 10,000 German, Austrian, and Czech Jews after the Kristallnacht. And like Manny's story, it's a marvelous story full of heroes and children who survived and parents who gave up their children, many times children not seeing their parents again in their life, and the parents making this awful, wretched decision to put their children on the Kindertransport, the trains to England and then some to Sweden. But I'll also tell you, here we are with our great friends at the American Swedish Institute and so many others who want to partner to tell you this story, that beyond the important substance of the exhibit is the relationship building. And that is such a beautiful part of America. De Tocqueville, in the 18th century when he visited the United States, always commented upon the American capacity for organizing themselves and building communal and volunteer organizations. And that is so important, and I know that's something in which Edina takes great pride. But now it's my huge pleasure to introduce Manny Gabler. You know, Chaim Weizmann, in 1936, it's hard to sort of find an analog to Chaim Weizmann, but if you were alive and Jewish in 1936, he was amongst the greatest of the worldwide Jewish leaders. And what he had to say meant much to both Jewish and non-Jewish leaders in the world. And he said at this time, and this is 2 years before the Kristallnacht, he said, "For Jews, the world is divided into places Jews cannot live and Jews cannot enter." And that was very much the case in 1936, and it even became worse in 1938 and beyond. So Jews were seeking refuge to any place he could go. For a couple of years, mandatory Palestine was a place where about 60 or 70,000 German Jews went, but the British closed the gates to Palestine at a certain point. And then there are stories like Manny's going to tell you about Shanghai and the 20,000 Jews who made it to Shanghai. But that was the fate of German and Austrian and Czech Jews in those years, and later Jews from all over, was the desperate search to find a place to live. Many came to the United States, but that was in the teeth of strong immigration quotas for this country. So it was a difficult passage, to say the least. But here's why I'm optimistic, and I'll go back to the ASI piece of the story. When we had our opening ceremony called the First Look for the American Swedish Institute exhibit, looked out in the audience, and who was there? Well, there was the general consul from Germany visiting. There was from Chicago. There was the British consul, the vice consul from Chicago. There was Daniel Ashheim, Israel's deputy consul from Chicago, Swedish consul, the Canadian consul. All these great democracies and their representatives gathered in one place in Minnesota, and the Israeli consul between the German consul and the English consul. So, of course, the British, they stood alone against the Germans in the fall of 1940. The Germans, what a remarkable story that's been. Now, a nation very friendly towards Israel and the Jews. The idea of redemption is quite the German-Jewish story. But what that does is gives me a tremendous amount of faith in the world. All these wonderful people gathered, the need for democracy, the need to protect democracies. So I bring you back to where we began, here in the City Council chambers of Edina, the seat of democracy, where democracy is at its most important, at the local city level. So I thank Edina for everything it's done. Have this tremendous opportunity now to introduce Manny Gabler. He's going to tell you the most remarkable story you can imagine. And when I look at Manny, I just see a smiling radiance, sunshine, goodness, and someone who celebrates life. And what a pleasure with Kathy, too, to introduce Manny Gabler. So thanks, everybody. Thank you, everybody in the virtual world. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if I can live up to all of that. Anyway, I'm really happy to be here and get a chance to tell you my story. Everything I'm going to tell you is from the eyes of a child. And it wasn't until later in my life that I learned what I had really gone through. And I'm going to talk about my experience of having gone to Shanghai with my family and 18,000 other Jews and how we survived the Second World War there. And those are, like I said, the memories of a young boy as I perceived them. And as children do, I didn't realize the horrors of what I saw until later in my life. Unfortunately, both my parents died when they were very young. My father was 49, my mother was 56, and on a stress level, they were 120 from raising two kids in a war-torn foreign country, twice. Some of the events I learned about later when I found my mother's family in Germany. I was an international salesman in 1981, and I went to the embassy in Berlin to find my family in East Germany, and I wanted to get permission and papers to go there. And the consul looked at me and he says, "Look, you're an American citizen, you were born in Italy, you were raised in China, you speak German, and you're Jewish. If they nail you over there as a spy, I can't tell them who you were." And he says, "So I can't guarantee your safety." So prudently, I didn't go into Chemnitz to find my family. It wasn't until 2003 when I got a call at my office from Manfred Gabler. And my son answered the phone. And when somebody called from Manfred, it was like AT&T trying to sell us phone service, because I go by Manny. And so, and there's a woman on the phone. She says, "Don't hang up. My name is Angela. I'm the daughter of his grandmother, his Aunt Ellie. And we were coming to the United States to visit your mother's grave in Pittsburgh." And I said, "Well, she's buried in California, so why don't you come to Pittsburgh and visit us, and we'll talk about that." And Aunt Ellie and Angela, who was a graduate student at the University of West Virginia, they came to our house and spent some time with us. And Aunt Ellie went through old photographs and gave us some insight into the past. We decided to do a family reunion in 2004. This was 2003 that they came over. And we decided to do a family reunion in Germany in 2004. And I and Kathy and my brother and his wife Diane and Ralph's children and my son, 10 of us, went to Germany to go to this reunion in Chemnitz. And we stayed at a little hotel. And we walked into a dinner that evening where I met 40 of my relatives I'd never met before in my life. And tears flowed like they are right now. And I found the joy of meeting a family, which I had never felt in my whole life, other than my parents. And so I realized the joy of that. And my parents were Simon and Irmgard, and they got, my mother wasn't Jewish. She converted to Judaism and changed her name to Esther when she converted. They were living in Chemnitz in southeast Germany, 50 kilometers from the Czech border. My mother was a poet, a champion skier, a guitar player, and he was bantamweight amateur champion of Germany, boxing. And he belonged to a Jewish sports association called the Maccabees. And because of his fame and this connection, he was also well known to the Gestapo and was in danger of being arrested. And so at great personal danger, my parents got married in 1935. And it was dangerous because Hitler had passed the Nuremberg laws on September 15th of 1935, which made it illegal for a Jew to be with a German. And the laws were made to protect German blood and honor. And only people of that ilk were allowed to be citizens of the Reich. Those that broke the law were sent to jail, and subsequently, after 1938, when they had served their sentence, they were arrested and sent to concentration camps around Germany, like Dachau and Treblinka, and many others. Now, the law had a devastating effect on the Jews because now the Germans wouldn't shop in Jewish businesses, and the German people would no longer even tolerate their neighbors, and the kids wouldn't be allowed to play with their Jewish friends and schoolmates any longer, and it was okay to beat up the dirty Jews. And everything was closed to the Jews: government jobs, medicine, education. And so the Jews had to take menial jobs in order to survive. And they had to wear armbands with a Star of David on them so that they would be known as people that weren't to be accepted. Now, Hitler was blaming all the economy of the 30s on the Jews. There were 500,000 Jews out of 67 million Germans. And Hitler blamed all of the ills. Food and fuel shortages were, of course, all fault of the Jews. The German people bought into this racism and hatred, and like I said, they persecuted even their Jewish neighbors. Now, the Germans, the Jews were proud of their contribution to German society, but the Germans saw it differently. They saw the Jews as stealing the sciences and controlling the banking and medicine and literature and news, and it was all the fault of the Jews. As the situation became desperate, my father and mother decided to flee to Italy in 1937. Fortunately, none of her Christian family turned them in, but my Aunt Ellie was caught not turning her sister in, and she went into a labor munitions factory as slave labor, and she had been pregnant when she got in there, and she had 2 miscarriages in 2 years. And my father had a sister named Ida in Italy, and so it gave us a connection to Italy. So we moved to Italy. My mother was pregnant at the time, so I was made in Germany. And I was born in Italy. But anyway, and I was born there in 1938 at Corso Buenos Aires 45, which is an apartment building in Milan. and my father made a living selling ice cream on the streets, and he fed our family that way. My cousin Joe, who was Ida's son, was sent to a concentration camp at age 5, and he survived there for 5 years. But Ida had a friend who was a friend of a bishop, and he sent 2 people from the Vatican to Germany to get Joe out of the concentration camp, telling them that they had made a terrible mistake, and his real name was Carlo Antonio, and he needed to be removed from there because he wasn't German and Jewish. So anyway, they saved his life. Pardon?
How did he end up there at 5?
They arrested him, the Gestapo.
He was in Germany then?
No, he was in Italy. Now, when the Germans came to Italy, they sequestered Mussolini in a villa with his mistress, and they took over Germany. So the Gestapo, Geheime Staatspolizei in German, which means secret police, state police, and so they ran Italy, and they wanted to start arresting Jews again and to solve the Jewish problem. And when I was born there, my parents named me Manfred Sigmund because the Nazis put out a book with authorized Jewish names. And to name me Aaron after my grandfather would have brought a great amount of attention to us. So my grandfather Aaron, my grandmother Anna, and my Aunt Ruth, they decided to stay in Germany, and they were then subsequently arrested, taken to a concentration camp and murdered, and everything they owned was taken away from them. The culmination came in November of 1938 during Kristallnacht, which you talked about. And Kristallnacht was kind of the epitome of the doom of the Jewish, 1,000-year-old Jewish community in Europe. And now the Jews were living in fear and anxiety because they were now the enemy. And they were being arrested and carted off to concentration camps. And little was known that when the Germans made an attempt to deport all the Jews that were living in Germany, and that failed, if a Jew wanted to leave, they could, except that the Germans took 90% of all their assets, they took away their passport, and they took away a visa because they were no longer German citizens. So it was pretty hard for them to leave. And some Jews who sold everything they owned and things they had hidden managed to get out of Germany. Unfortunately, there was no place to run to. Every country in the world had their international restrictions, and the Jews had no place to go. And then miraculously, an opportunity arose, and it was Shanghai. Now, with the help of anti-German Italian partisans, my parents were taken to Genoa, where they got on a ship that went to Shanghai. And they were able to leave because all they needed at that time was just a ship's passage. And they were luxury cruise ships, and nobody had the money to go on them. And there was a Hebrew assistance group that helped them buy tickets. So anyway, they sailed 8,000 miles through the Suez Canal and down around India, up into China, the Yangtze River and the Huangpu River, and they landed at the International Settlement in Shanghai, which was owned by the British. And I've got to give you a little bit of history. The International Settlement was owned by the British. In the early 1800s, the British were importing teas and silks from China, and they had nothing to sell the Chinese. So they grew opium in India and sold that to the Chinese, and so all the merchants became addicted, and then they had what they called the Opium Wars in the 1840s. And of course the Chinese couldn't take their wooden sampans and beat the British frigates, so the British set up 5 ports in Shanghai, in China, Shanghai being the smallest one of them, and they set that up as their own international settlement and favored nation status. They had their own laws in their own international settlement, and even the Chinese weren't welcome in this area. Now Shanghai grew and it became, the French did the same thing. And Shanghai grew and became the international center of commerce for China. I'm sure you've all seen pictures of the Bund, which is an area along the Huangpu River that was all European architecture and banks and restaurants and hotels in Shanghai. In 1937, the Japanese attacked China, Shanghai included, and they came into Shanghai and occupied it, but they didn't want to be involved with the commerce that was going on, and they wanted it to continue, so they left the British and the French alone. And so when the refugees landed, the docks were by Hongqiu, which was the poorest part of Shanghai and had been bombed by the Japanese and was pretty much destroyed. So the Jews were able to get off the ships, and they landed in the Hongqiu area and somehow managed to live there, and they wanted to because it was the cheapest rent and the cheapest food you could get in Shanghai. And it was the poorest part of Shanghai. And unfortunately, there were some very wealthy Jewish merchants that had been in China since the 1800s, and they were the Sassoon family and the Kaduri family, and they were enormously wealthy Jewish merchants. And they controlled all the commerce, and they put up the money and rebuilt buildings in the Hongqiu and turned them into bunk beds with everything from 15 per room to 150 people per room to give the refugees a place to live. And they had a soup kitchen, and they had sort of showers and barely toilet facilities. And but it changed almost daily with more and more people coming, so they were always in flux trying to feed people. And finally the they sent flatbed trucks to the docks to pick up the people and take them to the places where they stayed. And they wore the same clothes every day because they didn't think they were going to be there very long, because Hitler was some kind of clown. And so they came there not for economic reasons, but for political reasons. And most of the refugees, they were 50% of them were over 40 years old. They had no skills as far as that Shanghai needed, because they didn't speak the language. English was the business language of Shanghai. And so they came there with clothes that were from the pretty easy climate in Europe. And here they showed up in a place where it was 140 degrees in the shade by today's standards of heat. And it was very cold in the winter because it was very wet. And so they were just totally not ready to be in that society. So they needed a lot of help. And most of them were they had nothing. And so they came and stayed in these, what they called Heime, which is German for homes, euphemistically. And Shanghai was rife with every disease known to mankind. The water was polluted and had to be boiled. And since there was little way of sanitary facilities, men they called potmen would come every day with a cart and take away the sewage in the white buckets, enameled buckets that we used. So we had no heat, and we slept in our clothes. And the bunk beds that they provided for us, which were steel beds, basically everybody got one sheet and one blanket. And in the rainy season, the rivers would overflow and the streets would all flood because the water level was 6 feet down in Shanghai. So I would walk to school in rubber boots, and there was everything imaginable floating in the water. The local drinking fountain was a wooden barrel set on legs, and it had tea in it, and it had a dipper. And my mother was just apoplectic when she found out that I was drinking from this fountain. Now, Hongqiu was the Jewish ghetto, and it housed all 18,000 of them in a square mile, which is about 8 city blocks by 8 city blocks. And the Chinese surrounding us were even worse off than we were. What little we had, they had even less. When I walked to school in the morning, I would walk past bundles of dead people on the street. If the Chinese had a family child that died in the cold, they would wrap them in a straw blanket, and a garbage truck would come in the morning and take away those children, plus all the other bodies from people that had died in the cold and disease. And I walked past these piles of bodies on the way to school, and I just didn't realize the horror of it. It was just part of the landscape. And the Japanese were very cruel to the Chinese. One of my friends saw Chinaman stealing a can of kerosene, and the Japanese tied his hands together and shot them off. Now, soon the local charity was overwhelmed. It took like 5 cents a day to feed a refugee. And when the charity was overwhelmed, the Joint Distribution Committee, which was Jewish philanthropists in the United States, put up money to feed the refugees. And they sent a woman from Baltimore, her name was Laura Margolis, to manage the badly managed relief effort. And she kept us fed and housed until 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and now everybody was the enemy. And they took the British and the French and then the Americans that were there and put them in camps outside of Shanghai, internment camps. But they still left us alone for a couple of years, and even let the money come back in. And then in 1943, they turned the area we were living in into the area for stateless persons, which was a euphemism for ghetto. And they then had us wear armbands based on what people could do outside of the ghetto as a job. And they had a Japanese man named Kanogoya who was pretty cruel, and he'd slap the refugees around and scream at people. And now, oddly enough, there were some Jews that had enough money to live outside the ghetto, about 8,000 of them. lived outside of the ghetto, but they still came into the ghetto to go to the Heims and get a free meal because they didn't have enough money for food themselves, but they did have enough money to pay rent outside of the ghetto. And people started to get jobs outside of the ghetto. My father was a mechanic, and he worked for the China Fiber Company, repairing their trucks and machinery. And one fella sold cook time to the women that lived in the ghetto. If they could get some food, they could find some cooking utensils and cook a pot of food. And we managed to get a really good education, the children, because Horace Kaduri built a school for us with a large soccer field with single-story classrooms around it, and we spoke German at home and a British English in school and Chinese on the street. And we played with Chinese children who accepted us as friends and without any bigotry or anti-Semitism. Now, when we moved into the ghetto, the Nazis came in again, and they had forced the Japanese to form this stateless person area, and they wanted to put us all on ships, take them out to the China Sea, and scuttle the ships and drown all of us. Unfortunately, the Japanese wouldn't let them do that. The Japanese had some kind of a respect for us because they felt that after they won the war, they would have to deal with Jewish merchants, and they wanted to use the Jews to kind of be a beacon to the West to talk on their behalf. Now, in July 17th, 1945, the Americans came in and they dropped leaflets over Shanghai telling us we were going to be bombed. And they made bomb runs over Shanghai, and they bombed a Japanese radio station right next to the ghetto, and they killed 31 refugees and maimed like 250 and made 700 of us homeless. And my father came and picked me up from school, and he had my brother on his shoulders, and we walked through the streets of Shanghai, and the whistling of the bombs and the concussions, and the sky was just on fire. And the buildings were all on the ground, and there was a lot of dead bodies on the ground, and the rickshaws had become ambulances, and the normally white cushions in the ambulances were covered with blood, and they were just transporting mangled bodies. And because the water was 6 feet down, we had no place to go for a bomb shelter, so we stayed inside the Heim, and I stuck my head under a chair hoping the next one wasn't for us. Goya was thrown out of his apartment after that from a Jewish landlord, and he was seen on the street, and he was beaten up by the refugees. A few days later, the streets were eerily quiet. The Japanese were totally gone. Life had become better. Now we lived in our own 10-foot by 10-foot room with a sink, a hot plate, and a straw mattress we all slept on. And because we were also malnutritioned, we were always freezing, and we all slept together on that one bed. All of us wore every bit of clothing we could to try to keep warm. And for the 4 rooms in the building, we had a concrete room with a shower in it, cold shower, which we didn't use in the winter, but we loved it in the summer. And we didn't have any flush toilet. It was still the same enameled bucket that we used. And outside there was a rusted sink to do laundry. And when the Americans came, my father, who was a mechanic, of course, got a job at a U.S. Army motor pool, making $60 a month. he was very valuable to the Americans because he spoke Chinese, English, French, Italian, and German. And so he was able to work with the Chinese workers. So now we had fresh vegetables and fish to eat and fresh chicken. And the ghetto came to life with more restaurants and businesses. And it was odd to see a building with a Chinese sign on it painted over in German. And my favorite time was my dad would take me to the motor pool, and I could play with the tanks and the trucks and the jeeps. And my father was teaching Chinese to some of the workers, British to some of the workers, and they would bring us a live chicken to pay for their lessons. And I would kill the chicken and clean it in the alley, and I didn't mind doing it because it really tasted good. Now, the American soldiers that came in, they were kind of lonely, and they adopted refugee families. And there was a Sergeant Larry who adopted us, and he would bring us things from the mess hall. And for my 7th birthday, he brought me an apple, and I had never seen one before. And of course, there was chocolate for me and my brother, and he did other things for us, and I was too young to appreciate it. For the next 3 years, we felt relatively safe and thought about leaving China. And then Mao came in 1948, and we became refugees all over again. Because my brother was born, most of the refugees left in 1947. And the Israelis sent 3 ships, Greek ships that they purchased and sent them to Shanghai to let the refugees go to Palestine. And about 5,000 Jews got on those ships, and all they had to do was just get on them and leave. And the rest of us, most of them left by 1947, but we had to wait till 1948 because my brother, who was born in 1940 in all of that poverty, he was a stateless person. So it took another year to get the paperwork together to get him out of China. So it wasn't until 1948 that we left. We sailed on an American troop ship, the USS General Meigs, and we went to Hong Kong, Manila, Hawaii, and San Francisco. And that was a real adventure for a 10-year-old. In Hong Kong, we took the tram up into the clouds, and we could see the China land. We could see the Portuguese Macau, and it was quite an adventure. And then from there, we sailed to the Philippines, and the Manila harbor was full of sunken ships. It was a sea of masts that we had to go through to get to the docks. And then after that, we went to Hawaii, and the Jewish community in Honolulu threw a party for us, and somebody gave me some cowboy pistols and holsters, and it was the first thing I ever owned in my life. The next day, we sailed for America, and a woman on the ship taught me how to eat with a knife and fork. And it was kind of weird having to cut up my food and eat it with a fork instead of chopsticks. And this time, the U.S. opened its borders to us, and we sailed into San Francisco at dawn, and that was quite a sight. And Shanghai had saved our lives. In 1997, I read that 50% of all the construction cranes in the world were in Shanghai. So Kathy and I and my brother and his wife Diane, we went to Shanghai in 1998 because I wanted to see it before everything went away. And so when we went there, I took all my father's papers with me, which I have some of those with me, and you can look at them. And I took my father's papers with me, and we hired a guide, and we asked her to take us into the Hongqiu area. And I started to walk around in the area, and I saw this place and said, "That's the Oil Moishe Temple." I went to Hebrew school there. And we went in, and a 70-year-old man named Mr. Wong ran this as a museum of the Holocaust. And the walls were filled with pictures of the ghetto. And I told him we were there just to see where I grew up and went to school and all of that. And Mr. Wong was kind enough to say, "What was your dad's name?" And I said, "Simon Gabler." And he had a book called Immigrantenadressebuch, which means immigrant address book. And all the Jewish refugees were in there. And we lived at 818 Tangshan Road, number 50. And I said, "Do you know where that is?" And Mr. Wong said, "I live there." And he lived at number 12. And he took us in, showed us his home, and he took us to number 50. And the nail holes from the mezuzah, which hadn't been painted in 50 years, the nail holes were still in that door frame. And that was kind of a profound moment, because it told me at that time who I was and why I became who I am, and why I was an entrepreneur and a positive person, because what could a corporation offer me that I'd been living without and done just fine? And so there aren't many survivors left. At 83, I'm out to show people that the history matters of Shanghai. And I speak at universities and high schools and like this, and many, many groups that I've met with. And I'm educating people so they can be the storytellers of the future. And when you meet somebody that says there was no Holocaust, tell them you met one. And I also want to pay homage to the people of China who took us in as their neighbors and were very kind to us, and of my family's resilience and all the people that helped us along the way. Thanks for listening. And I think you have anybody have any questions? We landed in San Francisco, and then we went to Pittsburgh. Yeah, you're on candid camera. And then we went to Pittsburgh, and I went to the University of Pittsburgh there. And after that, I moved to Los Angeles. Then I went into the Army and became an airborne medic. And then I got into the record business and the music business. That's how I ended my life. And I started a company doing audio video systems in homes, and finally sold that company, and I'm retired. Quick story.
Finish that geography part of it. What? Oh, sorry. So how did you end up in Minnesota?
Remember I said I was an international sales rep in 1981? Well, at that time, I was opening up distributorships around the world for Hondo guitars. And I sold 91,000 guitars in 1981 worldwide. And the dollar went nuts against all the foreign currencies. And everything I sold had to be paid for in U.S. dollars because it came out of factories in Korea and Taiwan and mainland China, and nobody traded in any of those currencies. So it all had to be paid for with U.S. dollars. And so when the dollar just doubled against all the European currencies, everything I sold doubled in price. So it had nothing to do with product, but the Europeans could buy stuff from Japan for the same dollars, the yen floated with the European currencies. So basically I was out of a job. By June I had sold 2,000 guitars instead of 45,000. And so I got a job opportunity up here, and it ended up going back into the music business. And I was a sales rep for Rickenbacker for 10 years. So it's a fun business.
What originally took you to Pittsburgh?
Can you take your mask off? I can't.
What originally took you to Pittsburgh?
I don't know the reason for that. I was too young to appreciate it. But I think my parents were offered a job there. My father was. And the United Jewish Appeal just swept up the refugees around the world and made opportunities for us. And they had an apartment for us and a job for my father.
I lived in Pittsburgh for a couple years.
Oh, okay.
I had a question. The family you connected with in Germany, were they your mother's family, your father's
Yes.
family, or both?
No, my father's family all got killed because they were Jewish, but my mother's family was not Jewish. That's how I knew they'd still be alive in Chemnitz when I went looking for them. My mother converted to Judaism because in Judaism the mother should be Jewish so the kids are born Jewish. Otherwise, when King David had a harem, he didn't want some Philistine taking over Israel. So. Yes, they were in East Germany. Yeah. Oh, they lived a horrible life too. They would sell their clothes to a farmer out in the field to get a bag of potatoes. So they had the same, and they were bombed.
So I have a question. Your brother is quite a bit younger than you.
3 years.
3 years. Does he have as many memories as you do, or was he too little to really take?
Well, he was born there, so he was when we left there. He was 7 years old. So, and my brother has a different take on it. He doesn't have the same emotional feeling about it that I do.
Yeah.
Manny, it might be worth mentioning the tight connection between Shanghailanders and the remarkable people that came out of it, like Richard Blumenthal, who was Jimmy Carter's Secretary of the Treasury, Nobel Prize winners, scientists, doctors, you name it. Shanghailanders as they went to live throughout the world.
Yeah. Well, like I said, 50% of all the refugees that came there were white-collar workers who had been at their jobs in Germany for 15 years. And a lot of them were executives of companies and were smart enough to get the hell out. That was a fellow named Horace Kaduri. He was one of the Jewish families that lived, and he put up the money to build a school. And we had a Cambridge curriculum. And so I got an incredible education. By the time I came to this country, by my age, they put me in the 6th grade. But I had 2 years of Latin, French, algebra, and I didn't really touch a book in this country till the 10th grade.
Can you still speak all those languages?
I speak German fluently, but Chinese, because of my age, I knew enough to, order a pound of rice or where is it, what time is it, hello and goodbye, but I couldn't carry on a conversation in Chinese. If I'd have been there probably another 3-4 years, I would have learned the language.
Could you write it? Did you ever write Chinese characters?
No, I think it takes a year just to. There's 3,200 Chinese characters, and up until computers, everything was set by hand for newspapers and that.
Manny, do you know whether there's much of a Jewish community left in Shanghai?
No, when we went back there in '98, there was only, I think, a handful of people that stayed there, but because of Mao, everybody had to leave.
What happened to the Kudari family? You know what happened to the Kudari family?
No, I don't. When Mao came in, he wanted to get rid of all the Europeans or foreigners, and anybody of wealth and intelligence, they were asked to leave as well. So the Kaduris and the Sassoons, I'm sure they were gone. But they were a worldwide wealthy family. They came from Iraq through India, where they made a huge amount of money. And the Kaduri family and the Sassoons, as you know, I mean, they were here in the United States with makeup and shampoo. And so they were a worldwide wealthy family community. And they were very family-oriented. And they carried their religion with them, very much so.
So when Mao came, he just made people leave. He didn't.
Yeah. I mean, you know, his minister of finance was illiterate. That was the thinking. Yes, sir.
Well, we had something in common. I was in the Jewish area also in 1998 when I was in China. And unfortunately, we weren't able to go to the Holocaust Museum because it was being renovated at that time. But there was also a Jewish community in Beijing, and there's also an unbelievable Jewish community in Hong Kong.
Yes.
And in Shanghai, you're able to go up to the Norreys and the Sassoon homes. They're up on the hill, and they have the whole community of everybody who was employed. They were part of a Jewish compound up in that area, and it was all kosher.
Oh, that's an interesting thing that you say, because
Black hats, very traditional.
Oh yeah. The last refugees to arrive were the Polish Jews. And they had a close proximity to the Russian Jews, who then supported, and the Russian Jews had been there for many, many years, not on the same level as the Sassoons and the Kaduris, but when they came there, they insisted on being kosher. And the Russian community put up the money for them to be kosher and have chicken on Friday night. And in our group, if we found a pig's foot, we would cook it and have it for soup.
Maybe Manny, you want to say something about the program we had a few years ago with the local Chinese community and the Chinese government in Chicago when we brought the exhibit, Shanghai Landers exhibit back.
Yeah, there's a local photographer named David Sherman, and he took photos of, and he made it his mission to get photos. Is that what you're talking about?
I'm talking about when that's great too, the transfer Remembrance, but also when we had the Shanghai Landers exhibit come to the JCC, and we had the Consul General from China come, and
Yeah.
3 other Shanghai Landers from Minnesota, and we told the story of the Shanghai Jews. Yeah.
Yeah, that was an interesting evening. It was just the three of us. Ellen Wisp from, she lives in Duluth, and oddly enough, she came over on the same ship I did, because she was born in Shanghai and also had the same problems as my family did in getting a stateless person out of the country. And the other one was Kurt Hort, whose real name was Horwitz, and when he came to the United States, he changed his name to Hort so he could find a job, because there was anti-Semitism here too. But anyway, Kurt was 92 at that time, and he died a few years ago. But it was an interesting evening because we had a great turnout, and we had a forum, and people were asking questions of the three of us. So thanks for bringing that up. The other thing was a thing called transfer of memory. And David Sherman, the local photographer, made it his mission to take pictures of all the survivors that are living in Minnesota. And they put together a transfer of memory exhibit with all the photos that he took. And it was a traveling exhibit. It still is. And it was here at the downtown library. It was at the Jewish Community Center, and many other places. So,
Manny, do you know anything about the decision by, whether it was a local decision in Shanghai or the Chinese government, as to how they went about the process of determining that they would be a home that would allow Jewish people to come there, thousands of Jewish people to come to Shanghai? You know how that happened?
well, the Japanese, even though they were in charge of Shanghai, and they were in charge of Hongqiu, which was an area inside the British settlement, the international settlement, and they left us alone. And the Kaduri and Sassoons put up all the money to buy the buildings in there and turn them into... So the Chinese government had nothing to say in that area.
But somebody in China made a decision to let you into the country in the first place.
That was the British.
Well, that was the British.
Yeah, because they owned the international settlement, and there were no Chinese laws that affected them whatsoever.
And there was a port, so you could just...
Yeah, and the port was right there by Hongqiu. So basically, we got off the ships and went to the Haime.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So is your brother nationality Chinese?
No, he had no nationality whatsoever, because he didn't have a German passport. He didn't have. As a matter of fact, I have a German passport, because Germany, out of reparation, gave me my citizenship back. And I'm a legitimate German citizen. I can land.
You're an Italian citizen.
I don't know. I never followed that up. But I guess I could be. I could be an Israeli citizen if I get on an airplane and get off an airplane in Israel. I'm an Israeli citizen. Any Jew that does that is an Israeli citizen. Italy, I don't know. But Germany gave me my citizenship back.
What year did they do that?
2 years ago.
Oh, just recently. So then are you a naturalized U.S. citizen?
Yeah, we landed in 48, and we were naturalized in 53.
Oh, soon.
Yeah, 5 years.
So then you were all...
Yeah, all four of us are American citizens. Well, my parents are dead, but my brother and I are...
And then your brother's not German because he wasn't born in
Right. Right. He was a nobody.
What happened was in 47 and 48, the Congress passed the Displaced Persons Act, and sort of as a form of compensation for not admitting people, including many Jews before the war. They made it easier for a short period of time for Holocaust survivors to enter the United States.
Yeah, they called it the open period and then the closed period. Yeah.
Just 2 years, 47?
Very brief period of time.
And that was the open period. Well, thanks for listening. Thanks. A few stumbles, but I did okay.
Thank you, Manny. Just want to end with a quick thank you to everyone who helped us out this evening. I want to start with Mayor Hovland. I'm convinced there's more than one of you because you are everywhere in this city. And I can't tell you how much we appreciate your leadership on our entire commission and everything you do for us in the city. So thank you for being here and being everywhere. I'd say the same for Steve Hunnigs. Everywhere in our community, Steve's there. He's involved. I know, I do too. And it's a great thing. Steve works on so many issues for the Jewish community and the entire community in general. He's one of the hardest working people that I've met, and JCRC does a tremendous job. So they do everything in front of the scenes, but they do so much behind the scenes. And if you get a chance, please check out their website and all the things that they do. I'd also like to thank our student commissioners, Francesca and Sabi. They did a great job today, and they do a great job as usual. They make meaningful contributions to our commission. They come to our meetings, and you guys did a great job tonight, so keep doing what you're doing. Also to Heidi Lee, and I don't know if Reese is here, Kareem. She's in the back. They're always working. Heidi and Reese and the rest of the Edina staff and the IT department. Thank you all for everyone who helped us today. Heidi and Reese assist us with everything that we do, and nothing gets done without them. So thank you both.
I brought the papers that I brought with me to China. My father, the papers I brought with me, I have this thing. The papers I brought with me that we took to China, my father carried around the world at great risk. And so I brought those if anybody wants to look at them. And then I have a picture of the Bund if anybody wants to see that.
Manny. I want to thank you. Well, first I'll thank the Days of Remembrance Committee. And a lot of work goes into an evening like this, and I want to thank Rick Ross and Cindy Edwards and our student commissioners as well, like I said before. And I also need to make a special mention to Jasmine Stringer-Moore. Jasmine was our chair of this evening. And wow, it's so much work that you do, Jasmine, and organize this, and we truly appreciate it. So thank you so much. It was not an easy year to try to figure out anything, and we didn't know where we were going, if we were in person, if we weren't. And so I need to mention that there are so many people joining us online, and they'll watch this later online as we transition from virtual to hybrid to in-person. So, and then of course finally I want to thank you, Manny. To hear the history firsthand is invaluable. Well, next time my children complain about dinner, I'm going to tell them about you and the chicken in the alley, because I don't think that they would complain quite as much. Your words are so inspiring and touching. And it's an incredible story, and to have seen what you've seen and to have the attitude that you have, I hope I can do half as much in my lifetime and inspire people like you do. So thank you so much. And just last thing I want to do is mention the HRRC has a lot of events coming up and many things that we do. One in particular is on September 12th, and that's the Stop the Hate event. And it's stopping hateful speech and actions directed at others based on religion, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. So we would love if people could join us for that. And then we also, on the back of your programs, there's a survey. And if you get a chance, if you could fill that out for us, and anyone joining online, if they can get the QR code and fill out the survey, it's up there on the screen for folks, and if you have questions about how to do the QR code, Heidi or the staff here can help you out with that. I can't help you out with that. And finally, as a token of our appreciation, Manny, we wanted to give you, Jasmine, if you ever stopped working.